Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at what your first set of modifications could be on your Model 3. Once you've done a few track days and decided this is for you, you might start to wonder, there's a bunch of parts out there I could get, there's a number of different companies. What do they all do for me and how might I prioritize investing in them? So the first thing I'll say in this is I'm going to show some pictures of different products from different companies, and I am in no way endorsed by any of these companies, and I'm not trying to push one over the other. I would encourage you to do your own investigations. There's a lot of very good information on the Tesla forums and other places when deciding which company you want to go with, or use products from a couple different companies. But I'm going to use some of these images just to show what's out there in kind of broad strokes of the set of different modifications you can make to your Model 3. So with that, let's jump into it. All right, the first set of modifications we're going to cover are what I would call general alignment modifications, and that is specifically camber arms and toe arms. So the Model 3 suspension is relatively fixed in how much you can change some of these attributes of the alignment. So from different manufacturers, you can get replacements for the front arms that allow you to change the camber up to about, I've seen about -3 degrees in the front. And the different options out there allow that to be done pretty easily once the arms are installed. They tend to have pretty quick ways to swap the camber back and forth. And then at the rear, there are replacement arms that allow you to adjust the toe-in of the vehicle as well as the camber on the rear as well. And what you'll find when you start tracking your car a bit more is, again, this is my opinion, that camber becomes quite important, not just for handling, but for tire wear. I don't know what the stock settings are on the 3, but I would guess it's got to be around 0 from what I've seen, or maybe slightly negative. But what I found is even in just a few sessions of being on the track with stock alignment settings and the stock camber, the wear on the outside of the tires was pretty noticeable. And so these are with some of the modifications you may want to look at early on, and they tend to be reasonably priced and, in my opinion, a pretty effective performance upgrade for your Model 3. So a natural next step from some of the toe and camber accessories we just talked about is looking into a new set of coilovers. Now these are available in different configurations from different companies that range from a comfort level suspension to sportier to competition level. And generally they get stiffer as you go down the line. But what these are going to really offer you is, like I said, generally a stiffer suspension, a more compliant suspension that will work at both, on the track and off, and the ability to adjust and adapt the dampers in the suspension to different situations. So they tend to be rebound and compression adjustable and easily adjustable. So you could change your dampening for street driving, and then you could have different settings for track days or possibly even different tracks. And the other thing these offer is the ability to adjust the ride height on your car. So the Teslas are generally fantastic in terms of their center of gravity with that battery, nice, all that weight under you. But lowering the car definitely helps even more, and will help your performance at the track. And these coilover kits offer that as well. Next up, there are various bearing and bushing replacements you can consider, which generally have the effect of tightening up the steering of the car, making it more responsive, and stopping different suspension parts from shifting around a bit, under a track situation. And these are, I would put them lower on the priority list. They're, I think they're nice to have if you really want to get serious about it. I think they do make a noticeable difference in how responsive the car is. But again, if you're looking to save some money, that's something you certainly could consider later. So next up, we're going to talk about brakes, and there is a lot of options here, and you can start with very little, and you can actually spend quite a bit on brakes. Now, I'm a bit biased because I have observed the stock brakes on the Model 3 can get quite warm and fade quite quickly, and I tend to be a bit paranoid about safety. So for me, investing in quite good brakes was a top priority. But others may look at that trade-off differently, or they're not driving as aggressively, and just choose like maybe a more um, financially reasonable path. But let's just talk through some of the options. Just out of the box, one of the first upgrades you can do on brakes are better brake pads. The stock brakes, the stock pads on the Model 3 are not designed for the temperature range that you'll get on the track, and can degrade or quite quickly, or just not perform. Like you may get brake fade, and eventually they can be damaged. In fact, when I took stock pads out on my Model 3, in one day at the track, the pads were already cracking. And so replacing your pads with more track-oriented pads is probably a good first step. And then the next thing to look at is the brake fluid and the brake lines. Now, the brake lines in the Model 3 are rubber, and under extreme conditions, the brake fluid can heat up quite a bit, and it can boil and cause problems in the brake lines. Again, ultimately brake fade, and I guess if you pushed it very, very far, brake failure, but hopefully it would never get that far. And you can get stainless steel brake lines to replace this. And then typically what you'll want to do is replace your brake fluid with a more racing-oriented fluid with a higher boiling point. And you can look up, there are a bunch of different options out there, but I believe like Castrol SRF is one. Motul makes a racing-oriented fluid as well. One of the things I learned in this that I was not aware of at first when I kind of went through the process of replacing the brake lines in fluid was with these kind of racing-oriented fluids with the higher temperatures, they actually have to be replaced much more often because they accumulate water faster than normal brake fluid. So just when it's sitting around, more water is being absorbed into the fluid, and when you get more water in the fluid, that becomes something that can boil when the fluid gets hot. So you actually need to replace the fluid quite a bit. I think when I looked at Castrol SRF, it was maybe once every 6 months, let's call it twice a year. I know some people are doing it every couple track days, depending on that. So that's something you want to factor in to, again, your ongoing costs of resources, brake fluid, time, if you're going to do the work yourself, et cetera. And then we haven't even talked about replacing the brakes themselves. You can, the first step you can take is just replacing the stock rotors and keeping the calipers that come with the car. And you can get thicker rotors with better cooling and venting that, again, will increase your braking performance, will dissipate heat better. And you can get those on the front and the rear. And then if you want to go a step further, there are a number of what's called big brake kits or BBKs. And these will typically are for the front and will replace the entire rotor with a larger rotor as well as calipers with much larger calipers and a much higher duty brake. And if you want to go that far, they're definitely more expensive, but are really kind of the best braking you can get on the Model 3. And in some cases, you can even go as far as getting carbon ceramic brakes, which are, again, much more at the top end, much more expensive, and I certainly don't have the expertise to know if they are worth it. For my purposes, I did go with a big brake kit for the front, and I did put better rotors on the rear of the car with the, obviously the standard calipers and upgraded pads. And the reason I did it was, again, more for safety, and I just felt like it was worth the investment just to make sure the braking system wasn't a concern. And I think the other thing to think about in your braking investments is how do you intend to use the track mode on your car if you have that. So if you have track mode, you can change the amount of regeneration you use, and you can turn off regen completely and it's going to drive like a gas car. When you take your foot off the throttle, it's just going to glide. and all of the braking force will go through that braking system, and obviously it'll have to dissipate much more heat. You can turn the regen up to 100%, which is more than it is at normal street driving, and obviously now the brakes will take less of the braking force, and it'll go back into the motors and battery. And again, that's something for you to think about and consider and watch how your kind of driving preferences evolve. Personally, I run in track mode with 100% regen. And I only do it's silly, but I do it for safety reasons again, which is, again, I'm paranoid. And I always think, well, if I had a brake failure or brake problem, I still have the regeneration system as a backup, which is always slowing the car down. I will say the regen is a little strange in that it is quite a significant force, a deceleration force on the car, and it makes kind of thinking about corners and coming into corners a little different, because it's almost like you're constantly trail braking, and you just have to learn to accommodate for it. It isn't bad, and remember, if you're just out there having fun, not chasing like the best lap time ever, you get used to it and you learn how to adapt to it. But it was definitely it's an interesting thing to learn how to work around. I have seen some people talk about the high regeneration causing liftoff oversteer in high-speed corners. I haven't experienced that personally, but maybe I'm just not pushing it enough. But again, in all of the braking kind of purchases and considerations, those are all things to consider. All right, next we're going to talk about looking at track-specific wheels and tires. Out of the box, I believe the Model 3 Performance comes with, I think, 235 width tires. They're all-season or summer performance tires. Generally, good all-around tires for driving on the street, but probably one of the biggest upgrades you can make is looking at a wider track-specific compound. And I would say if you're going to go down this path, pause and do a lot of research, and also make sure you have invested in the various suspension accessories first. You don't want to put a whole bunch of money into a great set of track tires and then not, have the right camber, toe, everything else to take advantage of it. You just won't be getting your money's worth, and you'll probably end up wearing them out much more quickly. Now with that, the reason I say to pause and think about it is, for me, this was one of the areas where I made the most mistakes. I ended up losing a decent amount of money through my mistakes, and I think, with a little more research and understanding, I could have avoided it. But if we just back up for a second, generally speaking, and so what I found in kind of looking at the community and talking to people is it is reasonably easy to get a 265 or 275 width tire onto your Model 3. Some people have gone further, and I think I've seen people getting a 305 under there, but you start to have to get really creative with, possibly grinding down your suspension a little bit, maybe rolling fenders, etc. Things get very, very tight. And what I found is, look around, and I would get recommendations from the community to understand exactly which wheels fit, which spacers you'll need, and everything else, so you don't make any mistakes. And I'll take you through one of my mistake stories, which was I wanted to get a nice set of forged racing wheels. I found some, locally from a dealer, which is a wheel specialist, and they were 18-inch wheels, which they claimed, fit the Model 3. And I said, great. So I picked them up. These were quite expensive wheels. They were beautiful. And I did get to put them on the car just because the car was still getting all the different modifications installed. I bought a set of tires for it. I got a set of Goodyear Supercar 3 tires, which again, good all-around track tire, and that's another topic. And so what happened was finally I get tires put on the wheels. I've spent thousands on this setup so far, and I get the car back, and I go to put the wheels on, and they don't fit because the lug nut holes were not big enough. Okay, no problem. We'll get that fixed. I have to get them sent to a machine shop. to get them bored out. Pretty normal. That was a few hundred more dollars. Great, get the tires back, take the car home. I go to put them on. These are reminder 18-inch wheels, so they're a close fit, but I was sold them with the understanding that these do fit the Model 3, and guess what? They did not fit at all. In particular, on the rear parking brake, the electric motor rubbed right up against the barrel of the wheel. It didn't fit at all, and there was no way it was going to fit. Even like grinding it down a little bit on the motor wouldn't do anything. It was just ridiculous. And so here I was. This was like a process of several months. I had already had tires mounted. I had them machined. There was no going back. And so that was a tough lesson I learned the hard way. And I did end up reselling the wheels and recouping some of the money, and they found a great new owner, so that's good. But I would look carefully at finding wheels that fit. Maybe work with someone in the community, and I'll put some recommendations for wheels to make sure you get it all right. And you'll need to think through, when you find the wheels you want, do you need spacers? What spacers do you need? Will it fit? And it's a process. And even after I got a set of wheels and spacers that I was told would fit, it still took some work to put them on, to make sure. Again, I got 18-inch wheels. I did have to grind some things down on the electric motors on the rear parking brake, and on the front it was very tight, and had to make room for the clearance in the front by grinding down pieces of the suspension. So it was a process, and it was much more work and money than I was anticipating. And I'll throw one more story on it, which was when I got the new wheels, and the recommendation was, okay, use 10 millimeter spacers on the front. I did that, and they said, well, okay, since you're using spacers, you're going to need new lug nuts. You're going to need longer lug nuts so you have the right number of threads contacting. Okay, no problem. I bought the lug nuts with the kit. Not lug nuts, I'm sorry, bolts. I looked at, I had never installed them. I looked up how to install them. It's like, this shouldn't be too hard. But again, I didn't have the time to go do that. So I took it to my local shop, and they recommended, they were like, well, you could do it that way, but we think it would be better if you just get new wheel bearings, and we can install the new bolts into the new wheel bearings, and then you'll have two sets, one with the shorter bolts and one with the newer. And again, they didn't force me into that, but it was like, hey, here's a choice you may want to consider. It might make it easier for you in the long run. Okay, I went down that path, a bit more money, more time, etc. So what I thought was going to be a quick purchase, easy, throw everything on, we're good to go, probably took a couple months to get sorted. So highly, highly worth it. Definitely do your homework. Ask around before kind of jumping in and just thinking any arbitrary, wheel setup is going to work for you. But I'll put a couple links to, things I would recommend looking into. Again, not an endorsement. I haven't used them, but they might be good jumping off points if you're looking into a track-specific wheel and tire package. All right, from there, if you've gone this far and you've decided I want all of it, you can really kind of keep going down the rabbit hole and, throwing more money at the problem. And there's plenty of stuff to look at here. You can look at aero accessories, rear wings, front splitters. There's a number of different options in that department. I haven't done any of that personally. I think it would be super fun, to be honest. But I also think, think about if you're going to make those investments, some of them can be, quite significant. Like if you look at some of the rear wings or splitters, you're probably looking at another several $1,000s. So be sure to look at your use case and make sure that they would be effective for you on the tracks you're running, etc. So if your track is pretty slow or doesn't have any fast corners, a rear wing may not do much for you. And it may be a waste of money. So really think through some of those purchases before you jump into them. They look awesome. I would love to do it personally, but with what I'm doing, I'm not sure it'd be a ton of benefit. Um, there, you can look at a number of accessories that will offer better cooling for your car. Again, if you will find sooner or later that you hit heat issues, either the battery's getting hot or the drive unit's getting hot, and you might need to take some, cool down laps to bring things back to a normal range. And if you're running in hot climates, that is another consideration as well. There are a number of cooling options out there if you want to consider those as a more advanced setup. And of course, you can get crazy and you can start replacing body panels and all kinds of things to really kind of lighten things up. And finally, another thing worth considering is replacing the seat and getting like a full harness system, safety system, etc. Now, again, that's probably further down your purchase list. Uh, and I will say, I think having some type of harness, not necessarily replacing the seat, is super, super nice because first, just the stock belt doesn't hold you in very well, and you'll find you're slipping around quite a bit, and just being that feeling of kind of being much more connected to the car with a basic harness system is very helpful. Now, if you want to take the next step and replace your seat with a bucket seat and use the harnesses with that, I think that would be fantastic. But again, I think that's further down the purchase path. All right, so now you've absorbed all of that. You've decided what set of modifications you want. Maybe you're going to do a few at a time. Maybe you're going to do it all at once. I think the next thing you need to consider is, are you going to do the work yourself, or are you going to have a local shop do it? And again, I think if you look, you can read a lot of the installation instructions for these online, and in my opinion, they look relatively straightforward and a great learning experience to do. But you have to think, like, do you have the time to do it? Can you afford to have your car out of service for however long it takes you to install them, or if something goes wrong and you need to take more time? Like, these are all considerations. And the other thing to consider is, do you have the space and do you have the tools to do this? And if you don't, that's obviously going to be yet an additional investment, and potentially a non-trivial one. So I'll tell you, I had a shop do all the installation for me. It was something I really, really wanted to do. I hadn't done much work on cars, and I thought it would be a lot of fun to kind of just go through the learning process myself. But I didn't have the time, and I couldn't afford to have the car be out of service for days if I made a mistake, or if I got interrupted. And so it was a tough call, but I did make that decision to ultimately pay for it, which it wasn't cheap. I think it was probably a couple $1,000s to have the work done. The flip side is, at the same time, I also didn't have the tool set to do it myself. And so I did some quick math, and I think just getting some of the basic tools where you're looking at, hey, what jacks do I need, the different torque wrenches, a set of jack stands, just some of the things off the top of my head, that was probably like another $1,000. So it's a trade-off, and it's something to consider. I called around quite a bit to look for local shops that had worked with Teslas and were familiar. And I think the different parts providers, like I've mentioned, Unplugged Performance and Mountain Pass, I think they probably have good contacts in different areas that can help you out with that. All right. Next up, I wanted to share some things I wish I had known or thought about, or learnings I had along the way. And these were also questions I asked, in forums and other places that I was learning. So hopefully these are helpful. The first one was, I was really worried about, like, how hard would it be to change from like a track setup back to a street setup. So if you have the track setup where you'll have, let's say, -2.5 to -3 degrees of camber on the front, you'll have camber on the rear, you'll have your toe set. It's like, should I be switching back and forth between the track and day driving? And the general answer you'll get from people is, well, if you want a car that's good for both, you're going to have to compromise and set your suspension accordingly. And I think that's a true statement. And my other observation is, it would take a fair amount of work to switch back and forth regularly if you wanted to. As I mentioned, in terms of like changing front camber, that's pretty straightforward, but then you'll have to go change, the toe settings, on the front and the rear. And I think you could probably get that down to a relatively mechanical process in terms of like the number of turns on each arm. And you'll probably need to recheck that once in a while, but it's work. It'd probably be in a couple hours to get that done, unless maybe you're awesome and can get it done really fast. But I netted out and it's like, well, I'm not going to switch back and forth between them. And I just leave mine in a track oriented setting all the time because I'm mostly just driving around town and I'm not too worried about extra tire wear. And I don't take any road trips with it. So that, again, that's something you need to consider for your situation. On the plus side, the dampers on your suspension can be changed very easily. So it would be no problem to switch between, a softer suspension and a much stiffer suspension if you wanted, going between track days and non-track days. I don't even bother doing that because I'm just running around town and I don't mind a slightly stiff suspension. Another big learning I had is I probably set my ride height too low. I went with some recommended ride height settings, which is definitely quite a bit lower than stock. Obviously, it's fantastic on the track, but it's too low for around town where the car is scraping on speed bumps. If there are driveways or other thing, you're scraping the front of the car. And since this sometimes gets used as a family car, that gets, let's just say, some negative reactions. And I have hit the underside a few times enough that it's worrying. And changing the ride height is, again, in my opinion, definitely something which is not easily done at home. I think I could be wrong on this, but some of the suspension kits I talked about and showed do not have, like, I would say, easy ride height adjustment. Like, you may have to actually take the shock off the rear suspension to change the ride height. It's not as simple as some of the other coilovers out there where you can just change, do a quick dial to change the ride height. I could be wrong. Maybe there are more easily ride height adjustable options for the Model 3, but mine certainly is not. And so my ride height is set a little too low, and now I need to go. It's going to be a bit of an undertaking to go get that fixed. So something to think about. Next up, things to consider. The brake pads can be noisy. You'll read this about performance brake pads, and so you will hear them squealing if you're just driving around and lightly tap the brakes. It can be noisy, and some people don't like that. I don't think it's a big deal with the Model 3 since you're rarely on the brakes anyway. And then finally, with all these changes, in particular some of the bearing changes I mentioned, and replacing a lot of the arms and stuff, replace it with much tighter, different style of bearings, and the car's noisier as a whole. Like, it is absolutely much tighter and more responsive to drive, but there is more road noise. There's much more there's a term for this, and I'm blanking on the term, but there's much more just general noise in the car, and it sounds a little clunkier. And that's just something you kind of have to deal with. I don't think it's a big deal, and I don't think it's very much, but it's definitely noticeable when I go between this and, I'd say more normal cars or a standard Model 3 or S. They definitely sound quite a bit different. So, maybe it's not just you driving the car, maybe it's shared or it's used for different purposes. Like, these are all trade-offs that you'll need to consider. And find that middle ground where you can do both, or realize you'll probably have to spend some time, taking the car from one setup to the other, and make sure you account for that. And of course, I forgot to mention one thing on the ride height, because I was thinking about track tires as well. Obviously swapping track tires on and off is super easy, and you can do that no problem. One thing I did notice was, and it kind of comes back to the whole tire and wheel fitment conversation. I think because my ride height was a little too low, and I have 275s on mine, a couple times I actually have had a front tire scrape against the fender, like if it compressed on a speed bump while turning, and I've taken a chunk out of a tire, and that's caused me to ruin a track tire accidentally just when I was driving around, and there goes 400 bucks. And so I need to get that ride height right, and definitely have made some mistakes along the way. But hopefully that helps you figure out where you want to land your configuration for your particular use case.